The universe, for all its infinite complexity and wonder, operates with the approximate efficiency of a bureaucracy staffed entirely by sleepy sloths. This was particularly evident in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Concordat, where representatives of 37 spacefaring civilizations were currently engaged in their favorite pastime, arguing themselves into political knots while accomplishing precisely nothing. "The Vraxian question remains unanswered," droned Ambassador Plixtorian of the Medusan Collective, his 7 eye stalks drooping with what appeared to be genuine boredom at his own speech. "For the 17th consecutive cycle, we propose a military solution." A ripple of murmurs passed through the chamber. The Vraxians, nicknamed the Monsters by virtually every species unlucky enough to encounter them, had been the boogeyman of galactic politics for generations. 8 feet tall, with exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire, armed with natural biological weapons that made Earth's most venomous creatures look like therapy pets, and possessing technology that seemed to violate several laws of physics, they were the nightmare that kept diplomatic corps awake at night. And yet somehow humans had drawn the short straw in dealing with them. "The human delegation will now present their alternative approach," announced the Concordant moderator, managing to infuse those last 2 words with the precise tone one might use when describing a plan to juggle plasma while blindfolded. Lieutenant Commander Elise Zhang of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps rose from her seat, desperately wishing she'd chosen literally any other career path. Behind her expressionless face, her thoughts ran along the lines of, how exactly did I end up volunteering to walk into the literal nest of the most feared species in charted space? "The UEDC proposes a direct diplomatic mission to the Vraxian homeworld," she stated, her voice steady despite the audible gasps from several delegations. "A single envoy, to establish communication without the appearance of threat." The Arcturian delegate, a being composed primarily of luminous gas contained in an environmental suit, brightened to a painful intensity. "You propose sending a military fleet to their doorstep? Madness." "No," Elise replied, already developing the migraine that seemed to be the primary qualification for her job. "I propose sending me, alone." The chamber erupted into chaos. Several species began shouting in their native tongues, translation devices struggling to keep up. The Centaurian delegate appeared to be laughing, though with their physiology it was sometimes difficult to distinguish between amusement and digestive distress. As the uproar continued, Elise caught the eye of Admiral Hirano, her superior and the architect of this particular brand of insanity. He offered what was probably meant to be an encouraging nod, but looked more like the apologetic grimace of someone who's just realized they've sent their colleague to certain doom. The truth, which none of the Concordat members seemed eager to acknowledge, was that 17 cycles of sanctions, threats, and military posturing had accomplished exactly nothing with the Vraxians. They remained isolated, dangerous, and completely uninterested in playing by the rules of galactic politics. Unhumans, being the newest and therefore most expendable members of the Concordat, had been volunteered to try something stupid or brilliant. The line between the two was so thin as to be practically theoretical. "Let me get this straight," said Dr. Kazuo Nakamura, the UEDC's leading xenopsychologist and Elise's former professor. "You're going to fly into Vraxian space, alone, land on their homeworld, alone, and attempt to establish diplomatic relations with a species that has, historically speaking, responded to contact attempts by converting the contacting party into what can only be described as finely dispersed organic particles." They sat in the officers' lounge of the UEDC vessel Improbable, currently en route to the edge of Concordat space. Through the viewport, stars streaked by in the peculiar blue shift pattern of FTL travel, a sight that normally filled Elise with wonder, but now only reminded her of her rapidly appointed appointment with what most of the crew were calling creative suicide. "That about sums it up," Elise replied, sipping her synthetic coffee and wishing it was something stronger. "Though you forgot the part where I have approximately a 12% chance of survival, according to fleet intelligence." 12? I'd have put it at 8, and that's being optimistic. Kazuv shook his head. "The Vraxians have no concept of diplomacy as we understand it. Their social structure is, well, alien is putting it mildly. That's why I'm going. Every multi-species delegation has failed. Every remote communication attempt has failed. Every military probe has been destroyed. But the Vraxians haven't expanded their territory in 50 years, despite having the capability. They're not mindless aggressors. They're defending something. Kazuo raised an eyebrow. And you think you can figure out what that is before they turn you into diplomat confetti? I've studied everything we have on them, and I have something no other envoy has had. She pulled out a small device from her pocket, about the size of an old Earth coin. A subspace translator? We've tried those. No. It's a quantum empathetic resonator. Experimental tech. It doesn't translate words. It translates intent, emotional states. If the Vraxians communicate in ways we can't understand conventionally, this might bridge the gap. Kazuo stared at the device, then at Elise. That technology is theoretical at best, dangerous at worst. So is flying into the territory of a species nicknamed the Monsters. I'm already past the point of reasonable risk assessment. The ship's comm system chimed. Lieutenant Commander, we're approaching the drop point. Your shuttle is prepped. Elise stood, straightening her uniform. Well, time to make history, or become a cautionary tale in the next edition of How Not to Do First Contact. Kazuo grabbed her arm. Elise, seriously, you don't have to do this. She smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. Someone does. Might as well be the person crazy enough to volunteer. Space travel, contrary to the glamorous portrayal in pre-FTL entertainment, was primarily characterized by two things: mind-numbing boredom and the persistent sensation that you were one technical glitch away from becoming one with the vacuum. As Elise piloted her diplomatic shuttle, the pretentiously named Olive Branch, toward Vraxian space, she had ample time to contemplate both these aspects. Computer, status report, she said, more to hear a voice than out of any need for information. All systems nominal. Entering Vraxian territory in 47 minutes. Hostile encounter probability 93%. Would you like me to recite your last will and testament again? I really need to have a talk with whoever programmed your personality matrix, Elise muttered. And no, once was enough. The shuttle's communication system had been broadcasting the standard diplomatic approach message on all frequencies since departure. A carefully crafted statement of peaceful intent, translated into the mathematical language that xenolinguists believed might be comprehensible to Vraxians. So far, the response had been the cosmic equivalent of a read receipt, with no reply. As she approached the outer boundary of what intelligence considered Vraxian space, Elise reviewed her mission parameters one last time. Primary objective: establish non-hostile contact. Secondary objective: determine why the Vraxians isolated themselves and reacted violently to approaches. Tertiary objective: don't get disintegrated, dismembered, or otherwise transformed from a living human into an interesting pattern of molecules. The shuttle's sensors pinged. Contact, 3 Vraxian vessels approaching at high velocity. Elise took a deep breath. Maintain course, continue broadcasting. The approaching vessels appear to be Vraxian interceptors, based on previous encounter data. Weapons systems are active. Survival probability now estimated at 7%. Your bedside manner needs work, Elise said, activating the quantum empathetic resonator and attaching it to her temple. The device hummed softly, interfacing with her nervous system. The Vraxian ships came into visual range, sleek biomechanical constructs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with unnatural precision, forming a triangle around her shuttle. They're scanning us, the computer reported. No weapons locked yet. That's unexpected. Elise's heart hammered in her chest. Open a direct channel, all frequencies. She cleared her throat. This is Lieutenant Commander Elise Zhang of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. I come alone, unarmed, seeking peaceful communication. As she spoke, she focused her thoughts on concepts of peace, respect, and open exchange, hoping the resonator would somehow transmit these intentions. For 30 agonizing seconds there was no response. Then a sound came through the comm system that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. A complex, multi-tonal series of clicks, whistles, and subsonic rumbles that no human vocal apparatus could possibly produce. The resonator at her temple grew warm, and suddenly impressions flooded her mind. Not words, but concepts. Curiosity / suspicion / protocol deviation. Elise gasped at the sensation. The device worked, at least partially. She concentrated again, projecting, alone/peaceful/request to communicate. Another burst of Vraxian communication came through, and the resonator translated, follow/compliance/consequence. The lead Vraxian ship adjusted course, clearly expecting her to follow. The computer helpfully chimed in, they appear to be escorting us rather than attacking, recalculating survival probability to 23%. Your optimism is overwhelming, Elise murmured, adjusting course to follow the Vraxian escort. As they approached what sensors identified as the fourth planet in the system, Elise got her first glimpse of the Vraxian homeworld. Unlike the sterile fortress-like world she'd imagined, the planet was a vibrant blue-green, with swirling weather patterns and visible surface structures that seemed to merge technology with natural formations. It looked almost beautiful. Beginning descent, she reported to no one in particular. If anyone's listening back at command, I've made first contact and haven't been atomized yet, so there's that. The landing zone was a vast platform extending from what appeared to be a living mountain, a colossal structure of stone, metal, and some biological component that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Vraxians moved across its surface with the fluid grace of predators, their 8-foot frames gleaming in the planet's amber sunlight. Elise's shuttle touched down with a gentle thud. Through the viewport, she could see at least 30 Vraxians surrounding the landing area, each equipped with what intelligence had classified as bio-organic weapons. The welcoming committee had arrived, and they were armed to the teeth, quite literally, as Vraxian dentition included serrated formations, capable of shearing through hardened alloy. Well, she said to herself, no one ever achieved diplomatic breakthroughs by staying in the shuttle. She activated the external atmospheric sensors. The air was breathable, barely, with higher oxygen content and trace elements that would make extended exposure uncomfortable but not lethal. She wouldn't need a full envirom suit, just a filtration mask. Donning the mask and ensuring the resonator was secure at her temple, Elise stood at the airlock. Computer, if I don't return, make sure my logs get back to command. And tell Admiral Hirano he owes me a drink in whatever afterlife we end up in. Acknowledged. It has been an honor serving with you, Lieutenant Commander. The airlock cycled open, and Elise Zhang stepped onto the surface of the Vraxian homeworld, the first human, and possibly the first non-Vraxian, to do so in recorded history. The gravity was slightly stronger than Earth standard, making her movements feel leaden. The air, even through the filter, carried scents unlike anything she'd experienced. Metallic, organic, alien. But most overwhelming was the presence of the Vraxians themselves. Up close, they were even more imposing than the briefing holographs had suggested. Standing between 8 and 9 feet tall, their bodies were covered in overlapping plates that resembled both armor and insectoid exoskeleton. What passed for their faces featured multiple sensory organs arranged in patterns that human brains instinctively found disturbing. Their limbs, 6 in total, ended in appendages that could reconfigure from manipulators to weapons in seconds. They were, by any human definitions, monsters. One Vraxian stepped forward, its carapace bearing elaborate markings that might denote rank or status. It produced that same complex series of sounds Elise had heard over the comm. The resonator warmed against her skin, and impressions formed. Challenge/identity/purpose. Elise focused her thoughts, forming clear concepts rather than words. Peaceful/communication/understanding. The lead Vraxian's head tilted, an oddly universal gesture of curiosity. It produced another sound, this one containing harmonics that made Elise's teeth ache. Follow/compliance/consequence, came the impression again. I understand, she said aloud, knowing the words meant nothing, but hoping her tone conveyed her cooperation. She gestured to herself, then to the Vraxian, then mimicked a walking motion. The Vraxian made a sound that the resonator surprisingly translated as something like amusement/affirmation. It turned and began moving toward an opening in the living mountain. The other Vraxians formed a perimeter around Elise, not quite threatening but definitely containing. As they entered the structure, Elise's diplomatic training kicked in. Observe everything, note patterns, identify potential cultural significance. The interior of the mountain was a marvel of bioengineering, with corridors that seemed to breathe and surfaces that responded to the Vraxians' presence. Light came from colonies of bioluminescent organisms growing along the walls. The entire structure felt less like a building and more like an organism, or perhaps a colony of organisms working in perfect symbiosis. They passed chambers where Vraxians engaged in activities Elise couldn't begin to interpret. In one, dozens stood motionless in concentric circles, vibrating at frequencies that made her resonator buzz uncomfortably. In another, what appeared to be younger Vraxians were manipulating energy fields with their limbs, creating complex patterns that shifted and evolved. Finally, they reached what Elise could only assume was their destination. A vast, spherical chamber at what felt like the heart of the mountain. The walls were covered in living tissue that pulsed with light in patterns that seemed almost like language. At the center stood a structure that defied easy description. Part throne, part terminal, part living entity, and upon it sat the largest Vraxian Elise had yet seen. Its exoskeleton bearing intricate patterns that glowed with internal light. The lead Vraxian from the landing zone made a complex gesture and produced a sound that resonated through the chamber. The resonator translated, presentation/anomaly/decision maker. All eyes, or whatever passed for eyes among the Vraxians, turned to Elise. The central Vraxian rose, towering at what must have been nearly 10 feet. It studied her for what felt like an eternity, before producing a sound unlike any Elise had heard before. Deeper, more complex, layered with harmonics that made the resonator at her temple heat to near painful levels. The impression that formed in her mind was explosive in its complexity. Curiosity/threat assessment/historical detect/purpose peregrine. Elise took a deep breath. This was the moment all her training had prepared her for. First, substantive communication with a species that had been isolated and feared for generations. She focused her mind, organizing her thoughts into clear conceptual packets that the resonator might transmit. Peace/cooperation/mutual benefit/information exchange. She followed this with more specific concepts. Misunderstanding/isolation/fear/reconciliation. The central Vraxian went absolutely still. The chamber fell silent, even the pulsing tissues on the walls dimming slightly. For a horrible moment, Elise thought she'd made a catastrophic error, conveyed something offensive or threatening. Then the Vraxian moved with shocking speed, covering the distance between them in 2 fluid strides. Elise held her ground through sheer force of will as the massive alien loomed over her. It extended one limb toward her face. The appendage reconfigured before her eyes, sharp edges retracting, forming what appeared to be a more delicate manipulator. With surprising gentleness, it touched the resonator at her temple. A sound emerged from the Vraxian, and the resonator burned against Elise's skin as it translated a tidal wave of concept. Recognition/ancient protocol/verification required/dangerous possibility. The Vraxian turned to the others and emitted a series of commands. Immediately the chamber burst into activity. 3 smaller Vraxians approached, carrying objects that resembled both technological devices and living organisms. The central Vraxian turned back to Elise and projected, "Demonstration/truth verification/core exposure." One of the devices was brought before Elise. It pulsed with the same bioluminescence as the walls, but contained within was something that looked disturbingly like a beating heart. If hearts were geometric, crystalline, and emitted frequencies that made one's fillings vibrate. The Vraxian gestured toward the device, then to Elise, then to itself. The resonator translated. Truth/core/exchange. Understanding dawned. "You want me to share something true? Something central?" Elise asked aloud, knowing the words were meaningless but hoping her intent would carry. The Vraxian's sensory organs adjusted, focusing intensely on her. Affirmation/requirement/trust foundation. This was beyond anything covered in first contact protocols. The Vraxian was asking for something deeply personal, a truth, a core belief or memory, as a foundation for communication. Elise had prepared for many scenarios, but not for alien vulnerability rituals. Decision time. She could retreat to diplomatic platitudes and likely fail, or she could take a risk and offer something real. Elise closed her eyes and focused on a memory. Her grandmother's death, the first profound loss she'd experienced. The grief, the confusion, the eventual acceptance. The understanding that life was fragile and precious. The reason she'd ultimately chosen diplomacy over other careers, to prevent loss when possible, to build connections that might transcend differences. She opened her eyes and nodded to the Vraxian, hoping her willingness to participate was clear. The Vraxian placed one manipulator on the device and another gently, almost hesitantly, on Elisa's forehead. The resonator hummed, and suddenly Elisa's mind was flooded with images, sensations, and concepts. A Vraxian world, centuries ago. Contact with the first alien species they'd encountered, initial curiosity and exchange, then betrayal. The aliens had stolen something precious. Biological samples, genetic material. The creation of weapons targeted specifically at Vraxian physiology. A plague that had nearly destroyed their species. Survival. Adaptation. A solemn vow. Never again would they trust. Never again would they risk their genetic heritage. They would be feared rather than exploited. Monsters rather than victims. Elise gasped as the connection broke, stumbling backward. The Vraxian steadied her with a surprisingly gentle touch. Understanding/query/difference. The resonator translated. Elise's diplomatic training took over. She focused on conveying, not all same/diversity/different intentions/possibility of trust. The Vraxian considered this, its sensory organs adjusting in patterns Elise couldn't interpret. Then it turned to the crystalline heart device and manipulated something. The object opened, revealing complex biological structures intertwined with technology. Core/vulnerability/offering, came the translation. With shocking clarity, Elise understood. The Vraxian was showing her their central vulnerability, the biological and technological heart of their species, the genetic repository they had protected so fiercely, the reason for their isolation and aggression, and they were offering it to her, not to take, but to understand. To see that what made them monsters was not aggression but fear, not hostility but protection of something precious. Elise felt tears forming in her eyes, a very undiplomatically emotional response, but one she couldn't control. She focused her thoughts, projecting with all her concentration, understanding/respect/new beginning/protection, mutual. The Vraxian made a sound that the resonator translated incredibly as something like relief/hope/caution. It gestured to the other Vraxians, who had been still and silent throughout the exchange. Communications/terms/possibility, came the translation. Elise smiled behind her filtration mask. Yes, she said, knowing the word meant nothing but the intent, everything. Let's talk. The Concordat chamber erupted into chaos for the second time in as many months, as Elise Zhang presented the preliminary terms of the Vraxian diplomatic accord. Representatives from 37 species shouted questions, objections, and expressions of disbelief, in a cacophony that the translation system struggled to handle. Silence, boomed the moderator, employing the chamber's acoustic amplification system. Lieutenant Commander, you mean to tell us that you not only survived contact with the Vraxians, but have negotiated preliminary terms for their participation in galactic affairs? Elise stood calmly at the podium, the quantum resonator still attached to her temple, now modified by Vraxian technology to function more effectively. Beside her stood a Vraxian representative, its presence in the chamber unprecedented, and causing several delegates visible discomfort. This is correct, moderator. The Vraxians are willing to establish limited diplomatic relations under specific conditions, primarily centered around biological and genetic security protocols. The Arcturian delegate brightened indignantly. They isolate themselves for generations, attack our ships, refuse all communication, and now we're supposed to welcome them because they've decided to stop being monsters? The Vraxian beside Elise made a sound that the chamber's translation system couldn't process, but which the resonator at her temple translated perfectly. Elise had to suppress a smile at what was essentially an interstellar eye roll. With respect, Ambassador, Elise replied, the Vraxians were never monsters. They were survivors of what essentially amounted to attempted genocide. Their aggression was defensive, not expansionist. And we're supposed to take their word for this? Asked the Medusan representative skeptically. No, Elise said. You're supposed to take mine. Unless you'd prefer to return to the previous arrangement of military standoffs and occasional vaporized ships. Admiral Hirano, seated in the Earth delegation section, coughed, in what sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter. The Vraxian representative stepped forward, a gesture that caused several security officers to tense, and activated a holographic projector. Above the chamber appeared images of the genetic repository Elise had been shown, along with historical records documenting the plague that had nearly wiped out their species. The Vraxians are willing to share their historical archives as a gesture of trust, Elise explained. In return, they ask for recognition of their sovereign biological rights and non-interference in their genetic affairs. The chamber grew quiet as the delegates absorbed the information. There's one more thing, Elise added. The Vraxians have technology that could benefit all Concordat species, particularly in the fields of biomedicine and ecological engineering. They're willing to share specific applications, under controlled circumstances. That got their attention. Nothing motivated interstellar diplomacy quite like technology exchange. And what do they want in return for this? Generosity? Asked the Centaurian delegate suspiciously. Elisa glanced at the Vraxian beside her, receiving a subtle gesture of permission. They want to be understood, not feared. They want security guarantees that their biological heritage will be protected. And, she added with a slight smile, they want to study us. It seems that humans, specifically, interest them. Evolution's cosmic joke. Why humans? Asked several delegates almost simultaneously. The Vraxian made that sound again, the one that translated as a mixture of amusement and exasperation. It then spoke directly, the resonator technology translating its complex vocalizations into concepts that the chamber's systems rendered into standard language. Because you sent her alone, unarmed, into our territory. Either profound respect or profound stupidity. Either way, interesting. A few nervous laughs rippled through the chamber. The moderator cleared its throat. Or the anatomical equivalent. We will need time to consider these proposals. The Concordat will recess for deliberation. As the chamber began to clear, Admiral Hiranu approached Elise and the Vraxian representative. I believe I owe you a drink, Lieutenant Commander. Several, sir. Elise replied with a grin. The Vraxian made a questioning sound, and Elise explained the human custom of celebratory beverages. To her surprise, the resonator translated the Vraxian's response as something approximating interest/participation/cultural exchange. I believe our new friend would like to join us, Elise said. Hirano looked up, way up, at the Vraxian. Well, that would be a first. Though I'm not sure our bars stock whatever it is you drink. The Vraxian's response needed no translation technology, a gesture that was unmistakably the galactic equivalent of lead the way. As they left the chamber, Elise reflected on the irony of it all. The Concordat had sent her on what amounted to a suicide mission, expecting either failure or martyrdom. Instead, she discovered that the greatest monsters in known space were simply protecting their most vulnerable essence, their heart, both literally and figuratively, and when offered understanding rather than fear, they had responded in kind. You know, she said to the Vraxian as they navigated the ornate corridors of the Concordat headquarters, back on Earth, we have thousands of stories about monsters. In almost every one, the hero slays the monster and returns triumphant. The Vraxian made a sound that the resonator translated as something between amusement and contemplation. Query/your story/different ending, came the impression. Exactly, Elise nodded. In our case, the hero realized the monster was just protecting something precious. No slaying required. Admiral Hirano, walking slightly ahead, glanced back. Though I'm fairly certain the United Military Coalition is disappointed about that. They had some rather expensive weapons systems they were itching to test. The military solution is rarely the elegant one, Elise replied, earning a harmonic sound from the Vraxian that unmistakably registered as approval. They entered the diplomatic lounge, a space designed to accommodate the bewildering variety of species that made up the Concordat. Conversations paused as the unlikely trio entered, followed by a wave of hurried whispers and the subtle movements of various sensory appendages. The Vraxian turned what passed for its head, observing the reactions with what the resonator suggested was something akin to sardonic amusement. Pattern recognition/predictable response/historical constant, came the impression. Some things are universal, Elise agreed quietly. Fear of difference is one of them. And overcoming that fear? Asked Hirano, signaling a server. That's where humans excel, apparently, Elise said. We're either too stubborn or too foolish to know when something's impossible. The Vraxian produced a complex series of tones that the resonator translated as something genuinely surprising. Admiration/kinship/evolutionary advantage? The universe, for all its infinite complexity and wonder, occasionally demonstrated a sense of humor after all. Sometimes the monsters weren't monsters at all, and sometimes the most effective diplomat was the one crazy enough to walk into the nest alone, unarmed except with the radical notion that understanding might be more powerful than fear. As they passed a group of wide-eyed Concordat staffers watching a human and a Vraxian walking side by side, Elise couldn't help but think that perhaps humanity's greatest contribution to galactic politics wasn't advanced technology or military strategy, but the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that some differences couldn't be bridged. That, and the questionable judgment to send their diplomats into situations with survival probabilities in the single digits. Word was already spreading throughout the diplomatic channels. The human had tamed the monsters. Except that wasn't what had happened at all. The human had simply listened, had recognized in an alien species a universal truth, that aggression often masks vulnerability, that fear drives isolation, and that offering understanding instead of threat can transform an enemy into an ally. In the days that followed, the Concordat would formalize the preliminary agreement. Vraxian representatives would establish the first ever embassy on their homeworld, with Elise appointed as the head of the Earth delegation. Cultural and scientific exchanges would begin, tentatively at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, as ancient fears gave way to curiosity. And somewhere in the vast archives of the Concordat, a mission classified as probable diplomatic sacrifice would be recategorized as successful first contact. Perhaps the most spectacular understatement in the history of interstellar relations. The Vraxian made a sound that the resonator translated as amusement/agreement/forward motion. Elise grinned. It seemed that having a sense of irony was universal after all.